On the Freedom Alternative, for over a decade, we've consistently been looking at things your favorite academic doesn't look at, though with a focus on politics. In this series, we've been examining the politics, the economics, and the geopolitics of two countries that are part of the Buddhist world. And while their politics is different, their economics and way of life is more similar than both of them would want to admit. And at least in part, this is due to their common Buddhist heritage. But does that even matter anymore? How important is religion in Indochina these days? In a world that assumes a decline of religion, how are things in this department here? Also, the assumption is that Buddhists are just chill people because Buddhism is a chill religion. But is that really true? What do the Christians in Laos think about this? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the 7th featured installment of the Khmer series. So, Theravada Buddhism, or the doctrine of the elders, is a cornerstone of cultural identity for both Laos and Cambodia, to such an extent that the communist state in Laos had to drop the red flag in favor of a Buddhist-themed national flag in order to prevent an uprising on religious grounds. Buddhist flags are flown in public like it's nothing, rarely alongside the national flag or the hammer and sickle, but also routinely outside religious-themed institutions as well. In some ways, the public presence of religion in this nominally communist country reminds me of the church commies in Moldova a decade or two ago. Newer subscribers are kindly invited to watch episode number 45 from the Propaganda Basement series for that reference. Just like the unreformed Marxist-Leninists in Moldova didn't see a problem with campaigning using Orthodox Christian imagery, the same is clearly the case with the nominal Marxists of the Lao People's Revolutionary Party. To this day, the stability of the communist regime in Vientiane relies on the regime's successful relationship with Buddhist observance. The nomenclatura may or may not be Buddhist, but for the purposes of the political project of keeping Lao PDR in existence as we know it and as you're looking at it, the top of the party is ostensibly Buddhist in public. In Cambodia, a similar story. The country's official religion is Buddhism and is the source of political legitimacy of the post-communist regime. The king's whole job is to be ostensibly Buddhist in public and act as a role model for a proper Buddhist life. His weirdness notwithstanding, the stability of the current regime relies quite heavily on the king never missing any Buddhist holiday and keeping as much of his weirdness as possible for himself. The king, constitutionally speaking, is not just a protector of the Khmer identity and Cambodian statehood, but a protector of Buddhist identity as well. And in a country where 95% of the populace identifies as Buddhist, the pressure isn't exactly negligible. So, politically speaking, Buddhism's role is very much transactional. The plebs will tolerate the regime within certain limits, and one of that hard limits is that the regime does a good job at being Buddhist. Now, that sometimes can mean relatively nasty things, though the nastiness is not identical and never has been. In Cambodia, the regime doing a good job at being Buddhist has recently led to the type of scandals that would be very much familiar in very religious societies in Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, Romania, or Greece, namely politicians getting in bed, sometimes literally, with the clergy to launder money or to expand the influence of either the state or organized religion. Now, in Buddhism, the latter is a bit more complicated than in Orthodox or Catholic Christianity. Because in Buddhism, the wats, or the temples, are not part of a centralized organizational structure. There is no equivalent of national bishop or patriarch. While there is nothing in Buddhism per se that says you can't have a national or regional organization, Theravada Buddhism, which is the more conservative branch, is the school of thought that is most averse to centralized authority. It's a religion that is, by design, decentralized. Spiritually, that may be a good idea, but in a political context, this necessarily leads to tension. All it takes is a few corrupt monks and monastic leaders to agree with a state grift, and suddenly you have a scandal, which is exactly what has been going on for almost 2 decades now in Cambodia. However, the solution is found also in the decentralization. By design, to the extent that we can talk about organized Buddhism, there's always a monk or a monastic leader that is not in with the state. For the Cambodian context, this works out pretty well most of the time. Well, that is to say until it doesn't, but I'll get back to that in a moment, because most of the challenges are in fact common in both countries, and to a large extent to Thailand and Myanmar as well. But until then, let me tell you a bit on the specifics of Laos beyond what was mentioned earlier in this series. So, as I was saying earlier, in Laos only about 2/3 of the population is Buddhist. The other third is mostly animists, but also a Christian minority. The communist state has been trying to stamp out animism for decades with very little success. Unlike in Cambodia, Buddhism is not a state religion here, but it is de facto the most prominent religion of the recognized ones. So prominent that the state maintains nearly all of these temples. The nomenclatura makes sure to be seen at main Buddhist celebrations, as I've showed you already, and perhaps the most striking deviation from the standard, there is still the so-called Lao United Buddhists Association funded by the state with the purpose of ensuring that nobody is being a Buddhist outside of the state's approved orthodoxy. Now, in practice, this has been less of a problem for Buddhism in the last decade or so, but for religious minorities this continues to be an issue, especially in more rural areas. In rural provinces such as Savanakhet and Salavan, local authorities and villagers have pressured Christian families to renounce their faith and convert to Buddhism or animism. The issue has gotten worse since 2020. While the regime was busy staying alive while sandwiched geographically between countries that played the pandemic project to absurd levels, namely China and Vietnam, old conflicts and tensions had enough room to re-emerge. So in 2020, 7 Christians in Pasing, which is a village in Salavan province, were expelled from their homes for refusing to convert, with one dying due to complications that arose from the poor living conditions as a homeless person in the middle of bloody nowhere in Laos. In 2024, 2 Hmong Christians in Boli Khamsai province were beaten up by villagers and the local police for being too Christian in public. Now, admittedly, also being part of the Hmong ethnic minority didn't help. This incident made the news outside of the local area also because it happened too close from the country's largest hydroelectric power plant, the Nam Theum 2 dam, which, of course, is under constant surveillance by both China and Westerners, albeit for different reasons. But such incidents don't just show the regime's preference for Buddhism, or at least not necessarily. In the 2020 incident, the central authorities punished harsher the animists, showing once again that the overall goal isn't the persecution of Christians, but rather stamping out animism, which is, of course, a futile goal, as shown earlier in the series. Large sections of the Lao population is deeply superstitious, and animist practices and beliefs fit that very well. And both harder and softer authoritarianism have failed to make a dent into that for half a century already. And in a demographically young country, that should signal that the change may not come this century at all. However, from the regime's perspective, there's also an additional pressure. Being China's de facto backyard, they also need to look good in CCP's evaluations. And the CCP, as I'm sure this distinguished audience is fully aware, isn't exactly known for its religious tolerance. One such instance is an incident from October 2023, around the time I was videotaping these images, really. Then, the Lao Evangelical Church reported that in the Khamwane province, 79 Christian families were pressured to sign documents renouncing their faith, with Buddhist practices promoted as the norm. This is a very CCP-style way of doing things. The local authorities act as the barking dogs, and the central government intervenes only when things turn ugly, like in the 2022 case of beating and killing of a Christian convert, Pastor C. Sengmane, in the same province. There, the incident was taken slightly more seriously, but administrative abuse and petty intimidation is usually ignored as long as it promotes Buddhism and not animist beliefs. And again, this is all transactional. The same communist state had no problem repressing Buddhist monks 35 years ago when it believed they could pose a threat to the regime, as detailed earlier in the series. The same Lao People's Revolutionary Party, which today approves projects and programs that the monks can engage in, and of course forbids and defunds the projects and programs that don't fit or contradict the current framework of the regime. I keep on mentioning this because it's very easy to fall into the paradigm that the US State Department falls into routinely when analyzing this region. The State Department publishes very good reports on religion and religious liberty in this part of the world. It's probably the best repository on facts and condensed news in English about this topic in this region. However, when it comes to analysis, the State Department has the worst takes possible, largely because those writing them are usually evangelical Christians themselves, and when they're not, they're effectively Westoid liberals. And Westoid liberals always have terrible takes on religion and religious liberty. Double plus bad when their job requires it, which is the case with the US State Department, both under Democrat and Republican administrations. Under Democrats, the guidance is usually to find oppressor-oppressed angles, and under Republicans, it's to find stories of Christian persecution. But the thing is that in Laos, both are true, sometimes in the same incident, and yet both the Westoid liberal and the evangelical lenses still yield the wrong result. And that's because in Laos, in particular, it is not Buddhist supremacy that is pursued, but the stability and supremacy of the communist regime. Buddhism is just a useful tool. Meanwhile, in Cambodia, Buddhist supremacy is the stated goal, but in practicality that merely serves to legitimize whatever the current people in power need or want, which is usually a grift. Now, with that said, that doesn't mean Buddhism doesn't serve a positive role either. It absolutely does. The temples are the de facto social services in most communities in both Cambodia and Laos, although for slightly different reasons. In Laos, it's mostly due to logistics. There is a temple everywhere, and I mean everywhere. But there isn't a government office everywhere, and there won't be anytime soon because that would upset a balance, be it a local political balance or the government's balance sheet. Because again, the Laotian people have gotten richer lately, but the government has not, and that won't change anytime soon. In Cambodia, the reason the temples are the de facto social services is also in part because Cambodia is dysfunctional random. And with Buddhism legally the state religion, the central government has the decent plausible deniability to remain dysfunctional even on basic services. For now, this trade-off continues to be seen as good enough, both by the regime and by a comfortable majority of the populace. But that may soon change. You see, the facts as they are now will necessarily breed tension. So, on one hand, we have the most conservative but still mainstream Buddhist school of thought dominating both Cambodia and Laos. On the other hand, we have both countries in top 20 and sometimes top 10 fastest growing economies in the world, which necessarily comes with things like consumerism, a more secular lifestyle, and a bigger urban-rural divide. Incidentally, each of these is a stressor to Buddhism as a sociocultural force, and Theravada Buddhism is, at least in theory, less prepared to deal with it. You see, the point of the ritualistic part of Buddhism is to act as cohesiveness builder in the community. The almsgiving is secondary to the primary purposes of most Buddhist rituals, which is why, especially in Laos, the government discourages large-scale temple donations. But the opening of the markets brought in a lot of foreigners who are, relatively speaking, wealthy compared to the locals. At first, it was only a few places which ended up commodified, but with time, the ideas and practices brought in by foreigners spread throughout the country. And with very little autonomy, Laotian monks are now left as sitting ducks in the tension between preserving Buddhist heritage and meeting modern economic demands. In the process, the spiritual significance is slowly eroded. Nowhere is this more evident than in this place, conventionally known as Buddha Park because, well, it's a park full of Buddha statues. For those coming from outside of the Buddhist world, this place is fascinating. And the stories in the audio guide are particularly entertaining, especially if you know a thing or two about Hindu mythology, because the guy who made this park was a Hindu-Buddhist syncretist. However, if you're an observant of Theravada Buddhism, this place is terrible. This sculpture park, located 25 kilometers southeast from Vinton, in a meadow by the Mekong River, is the creation of a mystic from the 1950s. When the commies came to power, he fled to Thailand and created another park similar to this one, just across the river on the Thai side. I'd show you that one as well, but I didn't have a visa for Thailand this trip, which at the time was also an extra cost. Anyway, today this one is run by the communist state. In the process, most foreign visitors are left with a wrong impression about Buddhism in Laos because it's never really made clear that this place represents the syncretic and clearly non-normative beliefs of Bunlewa Sulilat, the mystic and sculpture artist that made this place. Sure, it's fun for the Indian kids as well as the Europeans who just want a good story, but it's also corrosive for the perception of the religious landscape of the country. Meanwhile, in Cambodia, the religious landscape evolves in line with everything else in the country, in a dysfunctionally random way. The good part of this is the increase of religious tolerance. Not that Cambodia really needed it after the Pol Pot trauma, but still. The less fun part, if you're an observant Buddhist that is the part where the Cambodian society simply secularizes rapidly. Again, this is also a demographically young country. The median age here is 25 or 26, roughly the same in Laos as well. And then there's the internal migration from villages to cities, which in itself is also a secularizing influence. Add social media brain rot to that overwhelmingly young urban population, and suddenly Buddhism is uncool. This is already visible. The number of young men entering the Sangha, or the monastic community, has collapsed, basically. It would have gone down anyway with the drop in fertility, but in reality, over the last decade, it went down far faster than the total fertility rate. The monastic community is still regarded as a source of moral guidance and is still expected to play a significant role in shaping social values and behaviors. But how to do that in 2025 is simply much harder than it was in 2010. In Cambodia, with less state interference, the two mainstream divisions, the Maha Nikaya and the Dhammayuttika Nikaya, have started to adapt. Now there's Buddhist TikTok channels in Khmer, and an app to remind users of the main events. This helps, but not enough to be sustainable. And by that, I don't mean that Buddhism is on its way out, but rather that its role in society, as it's known today, will simply not be the same in a decade, and maybe even less than that. Also, in Cambodia, the de facto situation concerning freedom of speech has been consistently liberal, or at the very least more liberal than in Laos for decades, which in this case helps a lot. The monastic community can draw inspiration and teaching from the Thai organizations, which are far more developed. Meanwhile, as you know, it was at one point illegal to study Buddhism in Thailand if you were from Laos. Today that is permitted, but there's still a level of suspicion if religious figures travel to Thailand too much. So accessing people like Sulak Sivaraksa, a Thai social activist and highly respected Buddhist scholar, is a bit more difficult, especially since his views on Buddhist economics for 21st century are not always well viewed by the Lao People's Revolutionary Party. But the biggest challenge comes to the Wats themselves. As the economy grows, the monasteries' role as centers for education and socialization will necessarily diminish. And as fewer young men sign up for them anyway, it's only a matter of time until their continual funding from the state will be questioned. Sure, it seems unlikely now, but these two countries have seen it before with things seeming unlikely and then suddenly happening. The idea of quasi-free elections or rapid liberalization of the economy was unthinkable in 1987 in Laos. But now it's the default, and not even the hardliners in the regime question it anymore. And then there's an issue that may or may not get me into trouble for saying it, but it also needs to be said in order to fully inform you. The reason the faith and the organizing has survived so well into postmodernity was the fact that the leaders were willing to be flexible. For instance, being part of the Sangha means adopting a life characterized by simplicity, discipline, and a focus on spiritual practice. Monks do shave their heads, wear robes, and are supposed to adhere to a strict set of rules designed to minimize attachment to the material world and cultivate mindfulness. But what it doesn't say is for how long. So in practice, serving in the Sangha is more or less a rite of passage for late teenagers and early 20s young men who would otherwise turn to crime or other less optimal activities. This really would probably appall the elders of the 1800s, but it's a modern and postmodern adaptation that has yielded remarkable results. Countries with very young demographics, like Cambodia and Laos, always see elevated levels of crime. This is true here as well, but if you go one step further, you will notice that the overall level of crime is still lower than in neighboring China. Turns out that offering a rite of passage for young men and a way for them to gain respect in society does have a depressing effect on crime. Who knew? Of course, I'm constructing a poor sarcasm here. This has been the primary benefit of maintaining organized Buddhism. Whether the regimes are aware of this benefit or not, the outcome really does speak for itself. But herein lies the challenge. In 2025 and beyond, the life as a monk is simply no longer attractive the way it was even a decade ago. And the societal respect that comes with a stint in the Sangha is no longer the way it used to be. Things still work as an inertia, but this model is ripe for disruption. And I'm probably degrading my karma by saying this, but the Sangha served as a de facto container for weirdness. You see, if you look it up in English, it says that these men commit to a celibate lifestyle, but if you ask, especially without a camera or microphone, you will soon find out that the guidance actually says no women, but it doesn't say nothing about boys. This is more or less an open secret. In the past, the weird ones were heavily outnumbered by more normative men, and thus the whole mechanism served both the divergent and the normative pretty well. Of course, I mean here the neurodivergent. But now, it's mostly the divergent who continue to sign up. This will necessarily have an effect on both how the faith is practiced and on how it will stay relevant in society. Now, I do not claim to be an expert in Buddhist theology, so I have no idea how this conundrum can be solved in a Theravada consistent way. But sociopolitically, I will have to notice the similarity with the Catholic Church. A lot of things are different, of course, but there is one similarity: the celibacy vow. The assumption runs that there have been more scandals with Catholic priests because more victims were willing to speak up. But what if that's not true? What if the increase in scandals is because the profession became less attractive as the world changed? And in the Christian world, the comparison is always made with other schools of thought, such as the more conservative mainline Protestant or the Orthodox world, where the priests not only can get married, but must be married in order to be ordained. That does seem to depress the number of unfortunate incidents and scandals. The reason I'm making this comparison is because a similar discussion can exist in Buddhism as well. In Central Asia, where several Mahayana Buddhist communities still survive to this day along the former Silk Road, monks can get married. They don't have to, but they can. Similarly, there's the Sakya school's lineage of married monk teachers dating back to the 11th century and still around in modern-day Tibet. There are also several Tibetan lineages that, although don't explicitly permit monks to get married, they do accept revered teachers who do not necessarily hold formal monastic ordination, and those may be married and have children. Up until modernity, the stability of the Theravada model allowed the faith to stay more consistent here rather than further north in Central Asia, or what is today the People's Republic of China. But now, that difference is no longer there. In fact, some of the Buddhist school lineages that are stricter in terms of lifestyle but do not enforce celibacy see growing enrollment in their sanghas. Sure, there's plenty of other factors, just like there's plenty of other factors that are driving a lot of people away from Protestantism in Europe and North America, but considering how sexuality is, like the Hindu-Buddhist syncretists would put it, a primordial energy, it's very hard not to think of this as a factor. So this could be one adaptation that we might see in the future. It would certainly help a lot with the nascent urban-rural divide, because this won't go away. As the economic and cultural distance between cities and rural areas increases, the chances of Buddhism becoming rural-coded increases as well. And if that happens, then a lot of easily predictable issues will emerge, such as the practicing becoming more conservative than the mainstream in the rural areas, while heading to effective disappearance in the urban areas, which in the end erodes this facet of national identity, and from there on, we can easily infer the consequences as we are witnessing them in real time in most of Europe and North America. So yeah, this would be the shortest version of the story of Buddhism in contemporaneity in this region. Of course, we have no way of knowing how things will be 10 years from now, but we know enough to expect disruption and change. And following this may also end up answering questions that we have in Europe. Is this phenomenon unavoidable? And if yes, are the consequences necessarily identical or at the very least similar? If they're smart, the Buddhist elites in Southeast Asia would study Europe in particular and develop a strategy that aims to avoid the pitfalls and the mistakes that ended up happening in Europe when it comes to this topic. And even this will get an answer in a decade or so. Are the lessons of Europe transferable when it comes to religion being tethered to national identity, as it is the case in Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, or Thailand? Maybe they aren't. But something tells me they are, at least in part, solely because the fundamentals of human nature have this tendency of remaining largely unchanged with geography. Ultimately, religion is one of the tools to address fundamental human needs in a society. There is no right way to do this, but there are plenty of wrong ways, especially when you're disrupting a system that has been working, albeit far from impeccable. And giving purpose and meaning to a segment of the young male population who wouldn't have gotten it in any other ways is a service that we lost in Europe. Here, they still have it, and it would serve them really well if they managed to adapt it once again to the new conditions. I don't purport to know how it's best, but I do insist that it needs to be done. And that will be pretty much it. The next 2 episodes will be dealing with ordinary life here. How does one go about when engaging in commerce? How do the locals have fun? How did things change lately? And much more. And since the difference between Cambodia and Laos are significant, we'll dedicate an episode for each. But until then, thank you for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and if you like this kind of content, please do consider becoming a member. These kinds of series are supported by our members, and it's their support that allows us to ignore so-called best practices on YouTube and focus on the less traveled paths, both literally and metaphorically. At the moment of this recording, we're attempting to reach Tajikistan, but if you're seeing this video much later, there's probably an ongoing project as well. Check out freedomalternative.com and see what's in the work. Full members get access to the videos much earlier, get to introduce new topics, and much more. Once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.